there we are. So just give me 1 second here. Okay, so I'm hoping everyone can see that. We've got, let me just change one quick thing here. Okay, so for folks that aren't, that don't know me, I guess I should give myself a quick introduction. My name is Luke Riediger. I am the executive director of the Applegate Neighborhood Network. I described earlier who we are, what we do at Applegate Neighborhood Network. My background is that I've lived in Southwestern Oregon my entire life, and I have studied pretty intensely the environment of the Siskiyou Mountains, the ecology of the Siskiyou Mountains, spent a lot of time in the backcountry, and in particular, am really interested in botany and also fire ecology. So I'm also, through my work with Applegate Neighborhood Network, do a lot of advocacy work and work to protect the biological values of the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains. So that's who I am. So tonight's presentation explores the historic landscapes of the Applegate River Watershed through lookout photographs taken in the early 1930s, as well as other photographs that depict historic habitat conditions and forest mosaics. These photographs also inform our understanding of historic fire regimes and their influence on vegetation. So this presentation provides a lens into the historic landscape and into vegetation change in the Applegate River watershed over a roughly 90-year period. So the lookout photos that I'm going to be using tonight and throughout this presentation were taken in the 1930s by a guy named William Bushnell Osborne and others. William Bushnell Osborne began working for the Forest Service in 1909 and invented the Osborne Firefinder in 1911. So the Osborne Firefinder was tested at 8 locations in Oregon and southwestern Washington, and began to be commercially produced in 1913 when it was put to use in at least 100 fire lookouts on Forest Service land across the West. And believe it or not, this invention that he created in 1911 is still used to this day in fire lookouts to determine the location of wildfires. In 1931, he invented the Osborne panoramic swing lens camera, which was quite innovative for the time and allowed the camera to swivel from a stationary axis, allowing one to take panoramic photographs. So this was utilized to aid in fire detection efforts at Forest Service lookout sites. And the photographs that were taken were provided to lookout staff and provided accurate depictions of the surrounding landscape, and then allowed that lookout staff to correlate landscape features to azimuth numbers on a compass. And so this would allow them to quickly translate to a map where a fire may be located, and gave them a really accurate way to locate new fire starts. So these photos were taken to aid fire suppression in the 1930s, but they provide a great lens into the historic landscape patterns across the West, and show what a lot of this landscape looked like before fire suppression was really effective on the landscape scale. So there are some limitations to using historic photographs from the 1930s to interpret historic landscape conditions. These include landscape conditions that are altered somewhat from the pre-contact era. And specifically, this includes the disruption or the elimination of indigenous land management practices. So in specific harvesting sites, foraging sites, and hunting sites, Native American tribes often burned and had, that burning had been suppressed in the valley bottoms near village sites, around mid-slope oak and bulb harvesting sites, as well as at specific high elevation meadows where they used fire to clear meadows and glades and keep vegetation fresh for wildlife and to manage for resources that they were utilizing for subsistence. So these cultural burning practices likely augmented natural lightning ignitions and were more prevalent in some locations on the landscape than others. So for example, this photograph shows the southwestern face of Wagner Butte at the headwaters of the Little Applegate River, and it's been documented to have been regularly burned by the surrounding tribes for bear grass and other resources. Another significant impact on the Siskiyou Crest fairly early on, and likely throughout the entire Applegate River watershed, was livestock grazing. And so this started in the 1850s as settlers and miners flooded into the watershed, and the damage was particularly severe from the turn of the century to about the 1940s and early 50s. So there were massive herds of cattle and sheep that historically ranged throughout what was then the Crater National Forest and is now the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, and that grazing was completely unregulated. And then in 1911, when the Forest Service, when the Crater National Forest was designated, the Forest Service began managing these lands, but there had been literally tens of thousands of head of livestock grazing across the Siskiyou Crest at that point for quite some time, and they had badly damaged vegetation, churned a lot of the soils into dust, and had already created the barren habitats known today as cattle or sheep barrens on the eastern Siskiyou Crest. So in fact, when fire lookout staff in the area were trained, they were trained to differentiate between dust storms and smoke when scanning for wildfires. And this is due to the widespread damage associated with overgrazing at the time. So areas all across the region were badly overgrazed in the 1930s when these photographs were taken. This is a photograph of the Dry Lake Lookout, which is actually on the south side of the Siskiyou Crest near Carbury Mountain. And this is actually looking into the Klamath River watershed, but it's looking across what they call Dry Lake, which to this day is considered to be a cattle barren because it's been so denuded of vegetation, mainly bunch grasses and other palatable or favored species. So that does affect the conditions that we're seeing in these 1930 landscape photographs. The other thing that's we need to take into account is that there was widespread burning taking place by settlers that occurred during the mining and the settlement era in the Siskiyou Mountains. So miners were widely reported to have burned large areas at high severity to expose the geology and potential ore bodies for hard rock mining. So from the 1850s to the early 1900s, this was very common. Ranchers also frequently burned the landscape to encourage forage for cows and other livestock. And it's been reported that fire return intervals could have actually been more frequent during that mining and settlement era than they were historically. And in some cases, those fires could have been burning at higher severity because, in particular, the miners were essentially trying to burn off the vegetation so they could see the underlying geology. So this photograph is not an Osborne lookout photo, but you can see at the upper part of the slide there, this is the Little Applegate River watershed around 1910. And you can see how barren and treeless the ridgeline in the foreground is. And most historians associate this condition with the influence of fires lit by settlers and miners during that settlement era. So another limitation in using historic photographs to understand historic vegetation patterns is that they are a snapshot in time. So they depict a certain stage of succession and a point of reference. And the mosaic that you're seeing in these photographs can and will shift over time in response to climate and natural disturbance processes. And this will leave some areas forested, some areas will be more open, and some areas are in an early successional condition, meaning that they're basically revegetating from a previous disturbance like a fire. And so this photograph is actually not in the Applegate River watershed, but I think it really shows this very well. This is from Bald Mountain, which is today in the Kalmiopsis wilderness. And this photo, you can see that on the south-facing slopes over in this area, you can see that there's a lot of young vegetation. This is growing back from probably wildfires that burned in the area. You can also see that early seral vegetation, the young trees coming in, revegetating those sites, as well as north-facing old forest back here, and some snag patches that are probably associated with those fires in that settlement era. So today, through many years of forest succession, much of this specific area is now covered in closed canopy forests of Douglas fir, with a few remnant meadows. So some significant changes in this landscape. And this could be, this kind of shows that these photographs are just showing a snapshot in time and providing that point of reference. So another limitation to using fire lookout photos is that they're often purposefully located on open sites rather than forested locations. And at times they were cleared to enhance the view. So this might give the impression that lands were more open than historic conditions might have actually been. This photo also is not from the Applegate River Watershed. It's from the Buck Peak Lookout in the Southern Cascade Mountains. But you can really see in the foreground there that this area has been cleared of standing trees to enhance the view. So that was common on some lookout sites where they didn't have a big rocky, peak or something that provided a big view. So as well as limitations, there's also some significant benefits to utilizing these historic photographs to analyze historic forest conditions. And this is especially true in the more remote locations of southwestern Oregon that have not been subjected to industrial logging or resource extraction in the 1930s. So when these photographs were taken, very little, if any, logging had taken place on most of the federal lands that are depicted in these photographs. This photograph's from Fishhook Peak in the Illinois River Watershed at the headwaters of Indigo Creek, and you can just see that deep closed canopy forest in the photograph here. And this is an accurate depiction of unlogged forests in the 1930s in this specific area. So another thing that's, I think, is important to consider is when looking at these photographs from the 1930s is that they depict landscapes that have experienced widespread institutionalized fire suppression for only 10 to 20 years. And at this time, fire suppression was still only moderately successful. So lightning ignitions were still burning across this landscape in relatively natural fire rotations, creating diverse habitat mosaics and plant communities. This photograph's taken from the Bear Camp Lookout above the Rogue River. It's looking down Stair Creek, which shows a natural fire mosaic with deep forests, with open areas, brushy ridges, early successional snag patches, like this one here you can see here from a recent fire. And so you can really just see the influence of fire on this landscape and the way that it's shaped plant communities and vegetation over time. Another thing that I think is really important to consider is that these historic photographs are inherently more accurate than computer models, stand reconstructions, or landscape descriptions on the coarse landscape scale. So although they depict a snapshot in time, they provide an accurate, unbiased depiction of the conditions at the time the photograph was taken. So this photograph was taken from Anderson Butte in the Little Applegate River Watershed. And I've zoomed in a little bit to show the density of forest at the headwaters of Deming Gulch at the time. So you can see this dense forest stand here. So rather than openly spaced groves of timber, these stands were dense, structurally vertical, and supported closed canopy conditions. So these are very similar to the conditions you see today in mid-successional forests in the Little Applegate River Watershed. So now we're going to get on to the photos here of the Applegate. So we're going to go through some photographs specific to the Applegate region, starting at lower elevations in the Applegate River foothills. This photo is from Cinnabar Lookout, up on the divide between Grouse Creek in the Little Applegate River Watershed and Beaver Creek in the Upper Applegate River Watershed. So this photograph's looking east towards Dutchman Peak out here in the distance. You can see it here. And at this time, the area was relatively open woodland of oak and pine that kind of crowded around that summit of Cinnabar Peak. And in previous years, this area was pretty heavily logged. And today it's mostly second growth stands of young pole-sized Douglas fir with some groves of pine and hardwoods. but it's very different than what you're looking at here in this photograph in the 1930s. So this is also from the Cinnabar Peak Lookout. This is looking north down the Grouse Creek drainage into the Little Applegate Valley. And although there is forest up here on this north-facing slope below the summit, Cinnabar Mountain or Cinnabar Peak appears to have that closed canopy forest up high on the ridge. But lower in the canyon on these east-facing slopes, you can see that it's relatively open woodland. And you can also see on this south and west-facing slope over here on Cinnabar Ridge in the distance that there's a big upland prairie or bald, what we call a grassy bald. And that has shrunk somewhat over the years, over time due to fire suppression and other effects. In the distance, I also just wanted to point out these are the foothills of the Little Applegate, which appear relatively open in the 1930s, and they continue to be today. But it's really difficult in this photograph to make out enough detail to deduct habitat conditions and compositional mosaics. So what you can tell is that it was a very open condition out there on those south-facing slopes, and by and large, it still is today. So this is a photograph also from Cinnabar Peak. It's looking south into the Beaver Creek watershed and into the upper Applegate River. The peak at the center of the photo here is Baldy Peak, which was at the time much more open on its north-facing slope. Today, conifer forest dominates some of these more protected slopes, along with live oak woodlands and some chaparral. The other thing I wanted to point out here is just this south-facing slope here below Cinnabar Peak. It's covered with relatively dense pine forest when this photograph was taken. And today, much of this area, much like the other portions of Cinnabar Peak, have been logged and have been converted to dense second growth mixed conifer forests. So we're going to move over to Anderson Butte here. This photo was taken from the summit of Anderson Butte looking east towards Bald Mountain and Wagner Butte. So this is Bald Mountain here and Wagner Butte in the distance. I think what's interesting about this photograph is that it shows really quite dense conifer forest here on the North Fork of Anderson Creek. And then lower in the watershed, you can see how it's really quite open and appears to have been burned off. We don't really know if this was due to natural ignitions, if this is a remnant of indigenous burning, or if these were from intentionally set fires by miners or settlers. But at any rate, what you're seeing is a mixed severity fire mosaic with dense forests at the headwaters that had likely underburned in fire events, and then more open habitats below that had likely burned at higher severity, creating those open, early successional or young habitats. So this is looking north from Anderson Butte, and it provides you a little more detailed look at the forest structure on the north-facing slope below the summit. So in the 1930s, these forests appear pretty dense, they're relatively even aged, and they're closed canopy. So these are, again, much like the forest that we see on the north-facing slope of Anderson Butte today. So this is a photograph again from Anderson Butte. This is looking west down Deming Gulch into the Sterling Creek watershed. So this is a pretty typical condition in the Applegate foothills, where you have these north-facing slopes here that are colonized mostly by closed canopy forest, a lot of which is late successional or old forest. And then on the south-facing slope that's more exposed to sunlight, you see that it contains really open forest habitats, oak woodlands, those grassy balds, and then up on the ridge line, you can see these buckbrush thickets right up at the top of the ridge. So this is the same view taken recently, and it demonstrates many of the same vegetative patterns. So the main differences that I see are that the woody vegetation here in the foreground, these juniper trees and the shrubbery, has grown up. And also these south-facing slopes have definitely become more, there's more conifers there, more dense forest than there was in the 1930s. The north-facing slopes on this side of the drainage are still mostly closed canopy forest, but BLM logging has converted many of the mature or late successional conifer forests into young or second growth forest. And And then recently, this photo is a few years old. So recently there was a large clear cut, private land clear cut down in Lower Deming Gulch that isn't shown in this photograph. So a little bit of change since this photograph was taken, but you can see how generally the landscape has changed over time, becoming more dense on the south facing slopes and, basically younger forests on the north facing slopes. So this is a view east from Tallow Box Mountain, looking over to Burton Butte here, Baldy Mountain, and Ben Johnson Mountain. So this is taken in the 1930s. And what you're seeing is a really quite complex mosaic of early successional or young habitat, chaparral, and what appears to be mid-successional, mature closed canopy forest here on the ridgeline. So this pattern is very indicative of mixed severity fire. And you'll notice these burn patterns on the north-facing slopes here, where repeat high severity fire created really open, brushy plant communities, and clearly, and conifer stringers, these bands, vertical bands of forest that run through those early successional or young forest habitats. So clearly in this locations, fires had burned in a mixed pattern, maintaining canopy cover in some locations and burning off slopes and areas to create chaparral and young habitats as well. So it's a mixture. So this is what it looks like today from Tallow Box Mountain. You can see that the forests by and large have matured. You can see that a lot of those open brushy habitats have closed in and grown up. And a lot of the chaparral or the brush that you saw in those early photographs has been converted at least somewhat to canyon live oak groves or to conifer forest. So pretty big shift over time, looking out east from Tallow Box Mountain. So this is looking west from Tallow Box Mountain, which is on the divide between Thompson Creek and Star Gulch. So you're looking across the Thompson Creek watershed here and out to Grayback Mountain out here in the distance. So you can see again that this mosaic of fire and slope exposure. So you can see how on this north facing slope, you've got pretty dense conifer forests. Well, on this south facing slope, you have this mosaic of open habitats, brush, hardwood stands. And you can see how the ridges here, all these little minor ridges tend to be pretty open. And then the drainages tend to have more closed canopy forests. So that was the condition in the 1930s. And this is what that same view looks like today. So you can see that the shrubbery has grown up in the foreground. You can also see that the conifer forests are now more uniform on the south facing slopes here on these ridges at the headwaters of Star Gulch. So definitely you can see that the forests have grown up and closed in since the 1930s in a lot of places. So this is looking south from Tallow Box Mountain into the Applegate Valley. So these are the south facing slopes north of the Applegate River. And you can tell that at the time they supported extremely open habitat conditions, a lot of open grassy slopes, and only scattered patches of forest or woodland. So these areas burned in two large wind-driven wildfires in the early 1930s. So there was a series of fires that burned through this area. And the second fire burned only about a year or two before this photograph was taken. At the center of the photo here, you can see this is the Humbug Creek drainage. This is the Wellington Wildlands area, and Roosh is over here. And this is kind of the Slagle Creek drainage and North Applegate. So you can just see that that entire ridgeline was really quite open due to that series of fires that burned in the area in the 1930s. And this is the same view today. So you can really see how in the foreground, the forest has grown up and there's much more woody vegetation, including vast swaths of chaparral that have colonized the slopes down out here in the background. And so, basically over 90 years, you've seen that vegetation fill in and grow since those fires. Some would say that this is a relic of fire suppression, while others believe that chaparral, oak woodland, and these mixed hardwood stands that regenerated after the 1930 fires represent a natural vegetation condition. So if a fire was to burn on these slopes in the future, you'd probably end up with habitat conditions similar to those that you found in the 1930s. And over time, they would likely regenerate into conditions that are similar to those that are found today. So this is an example of what we call a shifting mosaic, where plant communities change over time due to climate, due to disturbances such as wildfires, and due to natural regeneration processes. So this is a view from Palmer Peak, which is up in the, again, kind of on the divide between Thompson Creek and the upper Applegate River Watershed. You can see this big rabbit brush clearing up here on the top of the mountain. And you can also see in the background, this is Tallow Box Mountain in the headwaters of Star Gulch. And you can see quite a bit of open prairie and upland bald up there. And these openings have been reduced over the years and kind of closed in, but some still remain due to soil conditions and due to that harsh south-facing solar exposure. So really hot and dry, and you get these grasslands that are persisting despite not having a whole lot of fire on the landscape. So this is looking southwest from Palmer Peak. Out in the background here, this is Grayback Mountain and the Grayback Range out in the distance. But here and kind of in the middle of the photograph, you can see a very, very clear mixed severity fire mosaic. So the pattern is very diverse with patches of young vegetation and brush that likely burned at high severity in recent wildfires or fires recent to the 1930s. And then you can also see that there's these patches of closed canopy forest that either underburned in those fires or didn't burn at all. So, you know, basically what's happened in this photograph is a lot more of these brushy areas have filled in with forest and live oak stands, and this vast rabbit brush clearing has closed in over time as well. So this is looking east from Palmer Peak out to Palmer Ridge. This is the south face of Palmer Ridge that we're looking at, and it's clearly burned repeatedly in this area at relatively high severity. You don't see a lot of snags, you don't see a lot of burnt vegetation. What you see is brush fields that have repeatedly burned at high severity, and you also see these mid-successional or mature conifer forests on the north slope of the ridge. So this is what it looks like today, and you can see that conifers and live oak have filled in the south-facing slopes and regenerated in the large burn areas. You can also see that this rabbit brush clearing has filled in and shrunk over time. So it's still there, it's persistent, it's associated with exposure, it's also associated with soil conditions. So it's been able to hang on there, but has been reduced due to the lack of fire on this site. So this is an interesting photograph. This is a view north from Mount Isabel. This is up at the headwaters of Forest Creek on the divide between the Rogue River Valley and the Applegate Valley. And you will notice that this is the first photograph showing really quite open forest conditions on a relatively large scale. So despite the current assumption that nearly all forests in the region were colonized by patchy, open-spaced conifer forests, very few of the Osborne photos actually contain significant open forest conditions, despite very little effective fire suppression at the time. So at any rate, this is kind of the exception rather than the rule. And these forests are actually in the Foots Creek watershed. This is a southwest facing slope or what you're looking at is southwest facing slopes. So that also contributes to their open condition. And I'm also going to note here that this is kind of at the margin of that area that burned in the 1930s. When we were looking at that slide, looking out at Humbug Creek and stuff, it's kind of unknown the extent of those fires. So we don't know if that fire burned over into the Foots Creek drainage and that actually contributed to these open conditions. But clearly there was a lot of open forest on the south and west facing slopes in the Foot Creek watershed at the time. So this is what it looks like today from the same location. You can see that the foreground has really grown up. We don't really know if the lookout was cleared at the time or if it was just naturally open and dominated by younger vegetation, but it definitely has filled in, obscuring the view down into Foots Creek. So we can't see Foots Creek, but today it's definitely very changed. It's a mosaic of logging roads, clear cuts, closed canopy forests, oak woodland, and chaparral, and it looks and feels very different than the open forest that were depicted in the 1936 lookout photos. I really like this photograph. This is looking southwest from Mount Isabel. This is the Humbug Creek drainage right here. So this is the right-hand fork of Humbug, and this here is the left-hand fork of Humbug Creek. And in the distance here, this is Thompson Creek back in the background. So you can see those big clearings. Those were likely, cleared by settlers. There may have been natural openings and whatnot there, but they likely have been accentuated by folks that were proving up on donation land claims, farming that land and managing that land for, and homesteading those areas. So those openings may be accentuated and may have been expanded or may have been created by that during that settlement era. One thing that I think is interesting is you can see this closed canopy forest dropping in on these west-facing slopes, dropping into the right-hand fork of Humbug Creek. You can also see that there's some openings up in here. These are likely from high-severity fire patches. The other thing that's interesting is this flank right here. It's a west-facing slope, southwest-facing slope of Old Blue Mountain. And you can tell that it was relatively open with a lot of chaparral and hardwood species regenerating after those 1930 fires. You can also see that this left-hand fork of Humbug Creek runs up to Billy Mountain here. And you can see that there is a dark patch of mature forest on the north slope of Billy Mountain. And actually the mosaic in that area is quite similar today with closed forest on that north-facing slope, northeast-facing slope, and chaparral and oak woodland otherwise in that left fork of Humbug Creek. Then, also just wanted to point out this upper slope here is very open. It's a southwest face. So it's got that harsh solar exposure, and it contains mostly chaparral and really nice open grown ponderosa pine trees. So this is roughly the same view today, looking down Humbug Creek, down out to Thompson Creek. You can see that forest still dominates this kind of northwest facing slope here, but it has been logged by the BLM. It's now dominated by younger, denser stands, plantation stands and such that are mixed in with patches of older forest. And without fire for about 100 years in this site, you can see those small ridgetop openings have disappeared. So they've basically succumbed to succession without the effects of fire. You can also see how the eastern flank, east-facing slopes here on Old Blue Mountain have really filled in and become much more closed with a lot of conifer forest and hardwood forests. So those chaparral and hardwood stands have been converted over time, and they've basically just matured since the 1930s. And like I said earlier, it's difficult to see in this photograph, but the mosaic out here on the left fork is really similar to what you see in the 1930s. So this is looking east down Forest Creek from Mount Isabel. And again, you can see these open grown conifer stands. Can't even really call them stands. They're just open grown trees growing in that big open area below the summit. You can also see a lot of closed forests. So there's a lot of nice old forest up here at the headwaters of Forest Creek. And then you can see these big openings down here. This is kind of the residential area to this day on Forest Creek. And these areas were likely, much like Thompson Creek and Humbug Creek, cleared by settlers, or at least the openings were accentuated by the settlers, proven up on donation land claims and such. The other thing that I would point out is just these open conditions here on these south-facing slopes, very similar to the kinds of conditions that we see today on south-facing slopes in the Applegate Valley. So this is the same perspective today, taken from the top of Mount Isabel. In fact, I'll point out that I think this tree here, maybe this tree, and you can see how the conifer stands have expanded a little bit, but most of this southwest facing slope, or southeast facing slope, excuse me, is still pretty open. There's still some, grasslands and brush components, open grown oak trees, and still open grown stands of mostly incense cedar up in this upper area. The other thing I would note is that this forest in the headwaters of Forest Creek, although portions of it have been logged, it still is closed forest to this day. So you can see that the you know, the closed canopy condition hasn't really changed significantly over time on that north-facing slope at the headwaters of Forest Creek. So this is from Stein Butte. Stein Butte's up above the Applegate Dam on the divide between Squaw Creek and Elliott Creek. So you're looking into the Elliott Creek watershed here. So one thing I would note is you can see this dense patch of, you know, large patch of closed canopy forest right here on the north slope of the Siskiyou Crest in the Dutch Creek drainage. And then you can also see this south-facing slope here on Elliott Ridge, which was very open. To me, what this condition looks like is a lot of fire and a lot of relatively high severity fire. So the fires were sweeping up that ridge and burning off a lot of that vegetation, you know, leaving some patchiness on that south-facing slope. But although kind of hard to see, you can see the north slope here is still closed canopy forest. So you can see how the fires historically behaved quite differently on south-facing slopes and north-facing slopes, and that's a pattern that you're going to see and you have been seeing throughout these photographs. So this is same view taken just a few years ago from Stein Butte. You can see how the old growth forest up here on Dutch Creek has been maintained in the Carbury Mountain inventoried roadless area, largely because there has been no roads or no logging that's taken place in that area. You can also see how this south-facing slope here has really closed in with young conifers and grown up in live oak woodland since the 1930s. But this north-facing slope has remained pretty consistently closed. So, you know, some changes and some continuity on the face of Elliott Ridge. This picture is a little hard to see, but this is looking southwest from Stein Butte into the Red Buttes Wilderness. And similar to the last photo, you can see that the south-facing slope of Elliott Ridge here was covered in early seral and stump sprouting shrubs and hardwood stands, likely created by repeated high severity fires or mixed severity fires. This rugged ridgeline back here in the distance with the snow-capped peaks is the Red Buttes Wilderness. And again, pretty hard to see, but you can kind of see how there's a mature stand of ponderosa pine right here below the summit of Stein Butte. And this is the same photograph or the same perspective today. You can see that face of Elliott Ridge, again, these live oak groves up here have closed in. They've matured. They may not have even become significantly denser, just matured over time, and the canopy's filled in. You can see that more conifers are growing on this east-facing slope here. The Red Buttes area, pretty consistently, you know, similar habitat conditions. You can see that snow-covered ridge in the distance. And I'd also point out that this ponderosa pine, that big ponderosa pine stand that you can see in that earlier photograph, has mostly succumbed to drought stress and to bark beetle mortality. So that's created some big snags, and it's now being regenerated with young pine and live oak groves that have replaced those mature pine groves that you saw in the 1930s. So again, that's kind of that shifting habitat mosaic that you see over time in response to climate, in response to, you know, forest disturbances and things like that. So this is looking north from Stein Butte into the upper Applegate River. And this is actually the area in the Applegate Dam today. This is lower Squaw Creek and upper Applegate River. This is all inundated by the Applegate Dam or Applegate Reservoir now. And this drainage down here is Squaw Creek, like I said, Squaw Creek draining into the upper Applegate. This mountain here, this is Collins Mountain. You can see that it was pretty open back then with a lot of brush, a lot of hardwoods, not a whole lot of conifers. But take note of all these little openings. Oops, sorry about that. Take note of all these openings up here. And then also take note of this pretty open grassy ridge coming down off Little Grayback Mountain into the upper Applegate Valley. So a lot of oak woodland, a lot of grassland, and a lot of chaparral back there on Little Grayback on that south-facing slope. Also of interest, I think, is these two age classes that you can see of forest here. So there's a young stand here that likely burned off at high severity as a fire reached towards the ridgetop where it's windier and more exposed. And then you can see this older forest down here that likely underburned in the same fire event that burned off this stand and then regenerated into young forest. So this is the same view today, and you can see that that young forest below Stein Butte has matured and is now closed canopy, Douglas fir. The mosaic back here on Collins Mountain is really quite similar with, a little bit more conifer growth, but a lot of hardwoods, a lot of chaparral, and you can see these openings have kind of persisted, the small clearings. And although kind of hard to see here, this flank, a little grayback coming down into the Applegate Valley here, you can see a little bit of it. It's still grassy, it's still open, it still looks very similar to what you saw in the 1930s. This is in 1934, looking from Windy Peak across the Siskiyou Crest and the Red Buttes Wilderness. So one thing I would note here is these open areas. This burned just a few years before this photograph was taken in the Windy Peak fire, or I guess, excuse me, about 20 years before this photograph was taken in the Windy Peak fire. But you can see how that fire really maintained these chaparral and early successional or young habitats. And then you can see how in the Kangaroo Roadless area and Red Buttes Wilderness, a lot of this old forest was growing in the 1930s and is still there today in the Cook and Green Creek drainage and the Butte Fork of the Applegate River. So this is the same photograph, or roughly the same photograph, taken after the 2017 Abney fire, which burned through the area. And you can see that it also maintained that chaparral component. You can also see that although the fire burned through Cook and Green Creek and Butte Fork, much of the old growth forest remains. And even some of these high severity patches up towards the ridge are similar to the conditions that you see in the 1930s. So this is, very characteristic vegetation mosaic with old forests that have been maintained due to wilderness protections and roadless area protections, and have been minimally affected by fire suppression in terms of their composition and structure. This is looking north from Windy Peak down to Elliott Ridge, the Upper Applegate. I think it's interesting to note these really open slopes on Elliott Ridge that we were seeing. And then also this slope here in the foreground is brush and young forest that had regenerated since the Windy Peak fire about 20 years earlier. This is the same view in 2021 after the 2017 Abney fire. And you can see it basically maintained a very similar condition in the foreground, but in the distance, the Elliott Ridge area has filled in. This is from Windy Peak looking east into the Siskiyou Crest and the Upper Joe Creek watershed. So you can notice this large meadowy area up here. This is Slaughterhouse Flat up at the top of Nabob Ridge. And in the 1930s, Joe Creek was pretty heavily forested with a little bit more open pine areas here and there, but pretty heavily forested. This is the same view today after the 2017 Abney fire. Burned at mixed severity, so burned off some areas at higher severity, and then underburned a lot of the forest as well. Just one thing that I would note is that you can see how Slaughterhouse Flat has closed in a little bit, but still remains persistent on the landscape. And there are slightly more open areas over here by Cook and Green Pass due to the effects of the 2017 Abney fire. So this is Whiskey Peak. So this is up at the headwaters of the Middle Fork Applegate on the divide between Middle Fork Applegate and Carberry Creek. One thing that I really wanted to note here is just these open conditions here on this south facing slope of Bear Wallow Ridge. This pattern is really indicative of repeat mixed severity fire. Also notice all this closed canopy old growth on the north face of Whiskey Ridge was quite dense at the time. And this is a view taken in 2014. So you can see how a lot of this early successional or young growth has closed in and filled in with conifers, but some of it has remained persistent due to soils and exposure. Again, this is the 1933 lookout photo, and I wanted to show you this to, again, look at these different vegetation patterns, the dense forest, the open areas, and then really take note of these windswept Douglas fir trees here. So there's windswept Douglas fir trees right here. They shelter actually the outhouse for the old Whiskey Peak lookout, but those trees really haven't grown, they haven't changed. They basically have the same character today, and it really makes you wonder how old those trees are. The other thing that I think is really interesting is how the 2017 Abney fire burned through this area on Bear Wallow Ridge and basically reestablished a lot of those open areas. And also important to note is this north-facing slope of Whiskey Peak or Whiskey Ridge here that was dense closed canopy old growth. It was logged in the early or in the 1980s and the early 1990s. And so you can see that there's now much more open. There's a lot more patchiness there. And this is an example of kind of deforestation and slow regeneration after the logging effects. This is just another view looking down north slope of Whiskey Peak, and another view looking at it today to really demonstrate that deforestation from the logging that took place 20 to 40 years before this photograph was taken. So this is also from Whiskey Peak. This shows a lot of old growth forest in Low Gap Creek down here and in Carberry Creek, Steve Fork Carberry Creek. And you can see how those conifer forests extended up the drainages on these south-facing slopes on Steve Peak Ridge. There's a lot of open area here on Steve Peak Ridge, and that's because this area burned repeatedly. There was a couple burns that were documented by a guy named Oliver Matthews in the 1930s. So shortly before this photograph was taken, there was a series of fires that swept across that ridgeline and created or maybe maintained those open conditions. Also important to look at is this is Grayback Mountain back here. And you can see how open a lot of those slopes, south-facing slopes were on Grayback Mountain, with conifers extending up the drainages a little bit, but very different than what you see today on Grayback Mountain. This is today. So you can see one of the things that I really want to note here is this. This was that ridge that was mostly old growth forest back in the 1930s. And it's been pretty much logged off by the Forest Service. So now what you see is a lot of young vegetation, a lot of young forested stands, and that old growth has mainly been liquidated on this lower portion of the ridge. You can also see how this face of Steve Peak Ridge is closed in over time. There's more conifers up higher on the slope, and that those burned areas have filled in with brush and knobcomb pine and other things like that. Also, I think important is to look back here at Grayback Mountain. You can see that it is a lot more forested, but you can see these kind of gray patches here. And these are areas that burned in the 2017 Credence fire and started to reestablish some of those open areas as fire burned through that landscape. So this is also taken from Whiskey Peak, looking southwest across really quite vast old growth forests up at the Middle Fork, headwaters of the Middle Fork Applegate River. This large peak in the foreground is Arnold Mountain. I think it's important to note that there is a high severity burn patch here, and you can see that these areas here likely burned at high severity, perhaps before this one did. A guy named John Knox McCloy, who was a miner and kind of backwoods hermit in the area, lived in the areas from the 1900s to the 1950s, and he documented this fire and was documented to have picked trailing blackberries in the area after that fire burned in the 1930s. So again, just a mosaic of fire and also a lot of old growth forests there in the 1930s. So this is the same photo today or just a few years ago. You can see that the high severity burn patch here is largely filled in, but still remains a little bit open. This area here that made it through the fires in the 1930s was clear cut by the Forest Service, but you can see how this area back in the distance in the protected Red Buttes Wilderness has remained old growth forest to this day. So again, kind of that benefit of wilderness protections, maintaining old growth habitats. So this is also Carbury Creek watershed. This is a picture from Steve Peak looking down Carbury Creek in 1933. What I think is interesting here is this open mosaic here on the ridgeline coming down off of Whiskey Peak. And also this area over here to the left, kind of the left-hand part of the photo, you can see kind of a valley down in here. This is this is Carberry Creek, Steamboat Ranch area. The town of Steamboat was down here. And there was a lot of mines back in this area between Carberry Creek and the upper Applegate. And that area was heavily burned by miners because they found lode mines back there. There were hard rock mining. And so they did a lot of burning. And you can see how they basically created grasslands here below what we call Burnt Peak. And you can see in the photograph above that area has closed in with forest and knobcomb pine stands and hardwood stands. And you can also see how this area has really closed in with forest, although you do have this patchwork of clear cuts here. So quite a different mosaic on the slopes of Carberry Creek today when compared to the 1930s. This is also from Steve Peak, shows quite a complex fire mosaic. So you got repeated high severity fires that burned up these south-facing slopes, creating or maintaining these chaparral patches or brush patches. And then you also had these stringers or these, drainages that maintained conifer growth. And you can also see a pretty similar pattern over here on Humpy Mountain, really quite open up on the slopes of Humpy Mountain, but a whole bunch of old growth here at the upper end of Thompson Creek. So kind of a mixed mosaic, mixed pattern in this area of old forest and young growth. Although outside the Applegate River Watershed, I thought these were good photos to share. This is Mount Ashland, and looking west out into the Applegate and down into the Klamath River Watershed. You can see a lot of open slope here in the foreground, and also a lot of open slope here out near McDonald Peak and Siskiyou Peak. And then a lot of pretty dense forest down here in the Beaver Creek watershed with some openings down here. One thing we do not know is that if this area was logged, because the Fruit Growers Supply Company was logging the Beaver Creek watershed in the early 1900s into the 1930s with railroad logging. So it's unclear if those openings are natural fire mosaic or maybe logging areas. But at any rate, you can see that the forests that were unlogged are dense and closed. So, one thing that I would note here is that a lot of people would say these open conditions were perhaps from fire. And I would, in this situation, disagree. And I believe that they're associated with heavy and persistent snow loads that were found in the region at the time and have been significantly reduced since the turn of the century and into the 1930s. So this is the same area today, and you can see that the pattern is similar, but the open areas have filled in with woody vegetation. And I think that is, could be a product of those reduced snowpacks and the longer growing seasons that we see in the high elevations now on the Siskiyou Crest. You can also see that the conifer forest has really come in, this subalpine forest up here near McDonald Peak. But the drainage down here in Beaver Creek remains a lot of fairly closed canopy forest. So today, similar habitat conditions in terms of closed forest, but there has been a lot of logging down in Beaver Creek, which has changed the composition and structure of those forests, likely more than fire suppression has. So this is looking east from Mount Ashland towards Pilot Rock. Notice these broad clearings here and out in the distance here on Ogden Hill. It's pretty complex mosaic here with open forests and closed forests and open areas, clearings. And also notice how little vegetation there is up on the high elevations here in the rock and such, pretty open around there. And today you can see how that open area around the rock is really filled in with forest and brush. You can see how in the distance Ogden Hill has really closed in with a lot of more closed forest. But you can see how these meadows here were persistent, although they have been developed. And what you're looking at is the parking area for the Mount Ashland Ski Lodge. So this is looking north and northwest from the summit of Mount Ashland to Wagner Butte and down the Ashland watershed. So the summit of Wagner Butte was a little more open than it is today, but you can really see how a lot of closed canopy forest dropped down from the Siskiyou Crest nearly to the valley bottom in the Ashland Creek watershed. And also take note of these open areas back here. This is Roxy Ann Peak, and this is the ridge leading up to Grizzly Peak. So a lot of open forest in that area, a lot of oak woodland, and a lot of grassland. And that mosaic has remained constant, pretty similar today. And that's because of the heavy clay soils and because of the harsh exposure. So fire suppression has had very little impact on that landscape mosaic or the conditions there, despite really no recorded fire history in the 100 or 90 years since that earlier photograph was taken. You can also see how a lot of the closed canopy forest up here in the McDonald Peak roadless area that has not been logged remains to this day. But you can also see how Wagner Butte has closed in. There's one meadow, one big meadow here remaining. And in those 1930 photographs, that meadow kind of extended in vertical strips up towards the ridgeline. So it's changed a bit, but some continuity as well. This is the western face of Wagner Butte in the 1930s, looking southwest into the headwaters of the Little Applegate River and over to Big Red Mountain and Dutchman Peak. 7 Mile Ridge runs down here into the Little Applegate River. So notice these big, wide open clearings up here high on the western face of Wagner Butte, and these vast, unbroken old growth forests down here in the Little Applegate River Canyon. These unbroken forests continued all the way up the eastern slope of 7 Mile Ridge and nearly to Big Red Mountain at the time. And, you know, these meadows here, these big openings are very dramatic. And as I mentioned earlier, they were likely created through a combination of heavy snow loads, which created shorter growing seasons and less woody vegetation, from historic lightning ignitions, and from a long history of tribal burning practices. Wagner Butte is well documented to have been burned by the tribes to promote bear grass and other resources. And that clearly helped maintain these big, vast clearings on the slope of the mountain. I also would note that this photograph was taken in the 1930s, and the settlers and ranchers also did burning in the Little Applegate watershed quite extensively. And they also grazed up at Wagner Butte. So these openings could have been accentuated over time as well through some of that settler activity. This is the same view today. So you can see that landscape has changed quite a bit. You know, being close to Ashland and the Rogue Valley, fire suppression has been particularly effective and aggressive in this immediate area. And in this extended fire-free period, the former clearing on Wagner Butte's western face has become mostly closed canopy stands of 70 to 90-year-old white fir forest. You can see a little bit of the clearing remaining, and it's actually more extensive than it appears in this photograph, but has certainly been extensively reduced in extent over time due to exclusion of fire. I also think it's important to look at the forests down here in the Little Applegate Canyon. You can see that they've been pretty heavily logged. There's a lot of clear-cut logging. A lot of that's private timber. There's also been a lot of high-grade logging in that area. And although a lot of old forest still exists in the Little Applegate River Canyon, vast swaths of old forest that were, you know, persistent and fire resistant, that, you know, were wall-to-wall old growth forest back in the 1930s, have been converted to young forests and clear cuts and such. And I think what's interesting here is that essentially the forests have been inverted. So the forests in the canyon, where they were most persistent historically, have been logged off because they are quite productive. And then these forests up here have moved into formerly open habitats. So this is also Wagner Butte, looking up towards Mount Ashland. I think it's just interesting to look at how a lot of the closed canopy forest in the Ashland watershed and these open areas up higher on the slopes here on Wagner Butte and Mount Ashland. You can see how those areas have closed in over time, those open areas, but that old forest in the headwaters of Ashland Creek remains. So this is Dutchman Peak, Silver Fork Basin at the headwaters of Elliott Creek. The mountain in view is Observation Peak. So notice how sparse that mountain is, likely because of heavy snow loads, but also perhaps because of fire. You can see there's a vast glacially carved meadow here. This is the Silver Fork. And then you can see how below the summit, things were quite open, very few mountain mahoganies, not a lot of brush, really open conditions down here near the horses. And this is the same area today. So you can see that greenleaf manzanita is filled in, a lot of mountain mahogany is filled in. And there's definitely more subalpine forest back here on the face of Observation Peak. It does generally cover the same extent, the same areas, but it has filled in. And then I would also note this area here that is really quite dense subalpine forest is an area that was badly overgrazed. And in the 1950s was actually terraced with bulldozers by the Forest Service to reduce erosion. And that soil disturbance triggered this colonization by forest species. This is looking down Yale Creek from Dutchman Peak. So you can just see a lot of old forest in the Yale Creek watershed. And you can also see some openings up here near Sally Glade below Little Red Mountain. This is the area today. So you can see that closed canopy forest is still, fairly consistent, although portions of it have been logged. You can see some logging down in here and over here. And a lot of this area has been logged historically, but it still remains closed canopy forest. You can see the grasslands and such on Anderson Butte and in the distance have remained fairly consistent. And this open area here is the 2002 Quartz Fire footprint. So a little bit different view today, but a lot of continuity as well. So this is looking west from Dutchman Peak down Yellow Jacket Ridge and the Silver Fork of Elliott Creek. This is the last Osborne photo that I'm going to be showing. You can see how the upper slopes here are pretty open. This forest coming up from the north facing slope, kind of comes up towards the ridge, but has some openings in it. And then you can see that there's just a lot of old growth forest down here in the canyon on Silver Fork. And although kind of hard to see, a bit of open forest up here on Yellow Jacket Mountain, which is serpentine, where low nutrient soils create a lot of open conditions. And this is roughly the same area today. So you can see how that conifer forest on the north facing slope has filled in a bit, become a little bit more dense. The old growth forests down here in the Silver Fork remain, and a lot of the mosaic out in the distance in the Siskiyou Crest, Scraggy Mountain, and out in the Red Buttes Wilderness remains that patchy high elevation forest habitat that you saw in the 1930s. So really quite similar landscape mosaic. And as I said, this is the last Osborne photo I was going to show, but I do want to show just real quickly some other historic photographs that I have that I think are instructive. So this is the town of Steamboat on Carberry Creek in the early 1900s, around, I think it's in the 19 teens. But I think it's interesting to look at this largely forested area here on Iron Mountain, and then this really quite open area here on Steve Peak that was documented to have been burned a couple times in the 1930s. I also think it's interesting to note that the forest here is quite open, was likely logged to, aid the settlement of this area and the construction areas. And then you can also see that there was already at this time irrigation ditches and mining ditches being developed even in remote portions of the watershed. So this is the Blue Ledge Mine. This is Upper Joe Creek up on Elliott Creek. And, again, you just see these old growth mixed conifer forests here towards the top of Joe Creek. And then you can see this kind of open area on Windy Peak. So this burned in 1911 and was actually the impetus for developing and creating a lot of the fire lookouts in the area. The folks were really concerned that the community of Joe Bar and the Blue Ledge Mine area would burn in that fire. And although they didn't, it really kick-started a lot of the fire suppression in the Applegate River Watershed and the development of lookouts. This is the Upper Applegate River near the intersection of East Side Road and Upper Applegate Road. This low summit here is what I call, it's unnamed, but I call it Low Mason Butte. This western face that you can see is quite open, is still open today. A lot of shallow soils, shallow bedrock that maintain oak and grassy areas that drop into the Applegate River. And the mountain itself is, maintains a pretty similar habitat mosaic. The river was clearly mined or denuded of vegetation at that time. And I might note that this area still has very little vegetation other than blackberries today. So slow recovery from that vegetation loss along the river there. This is also the Upper Applegate River further upstream near Sanctuary 1, between Sanctuary 1 and the Mule Mountain Trailhead. So you'll notice there's a lot of conifer forest dropping right into the river here where Sanctuary 1 exists today. So clearly a lot of those flats around Sanctuary 1 were accentuated or cleared by settlers. And then you can see how that kind of more dense forest transitions into more open forest as you extend up the ridgeline here. So just an interesting mosaic and shows that forest habitats did extend all the way down into the Applegate Valley and into the Applegate River in the settlement era. This is the same general area, but you can see a lot of open forest over here across the river, which is interesting because this is really quite open area today down at the bottom of Kinney Creek. And there are some big old growth, open grown oaks and such in the agricultural fields. So I think this was probably an example of, an open area during the 1930s, likely accentuated by settlement, but it does appear that some of this vegetation was pretty open grown for a long period of time. This is from Carberry Creek. I think this is interesting just because it shows this really dense old forest back here near the drainage. And this is around the turn of the century. This is 1910. This is the Ashland watershed. And you can notice the relatively open understory conditions underneath this pine stand, likely moderated, not necessarily through fire, but also through moderate levels of canopy and relatively dense forest stands. So this photo demonstrates that pine stands were not necessarily uniformly open and widely spaced, but also could grow in fairly closed conditions in the historic era. This is from the forest above Jacksonville, which shows kind of some open pine forest. And this is a photograph taken in 1916 by John Gribble, who was one of our first forest rangers at the time, the Crater National Forest. This is the Little Applegate River Canyon. This is Trillium Mountain. Folks that know that area, the Trillium Farm is down in this area. And you can see that the area was quite open at the time. There was a lot of, obviously clearly natural fire ignitions. There was native tribes that lived in that area and were doing, practicing their subsistence and indigenous burning practices. And there was also a lot of burning by ranchers that took place into the 19-teens and into the 1930s even. And many of these slopes are pretty open still today, but they have certainly filled in since this photograph, where you can see that large portions of these ridges were just grassland. And they're now kind of a mixture of grassland and oak woodland and chaparral with some dry pine habitats. So a little quite different today. I'm not sure exactly when this picture was taken. I got this from Janine Sathery, but this is the Applegate Dam area before obviously being inundated by the Applegate Reservoir. I think this is interesting just because it shows how in the upper portions of the Applegate River, there's a lot more conifer forest than down in the lower valley. You can see how these conifer forests drop in to the oak woodlands and into the kind of pastoral areas down there in the valley bottom. This is also the Applegate Dam area before obviously the reservoir and the dam was built. I just think it's interesting to see the conditions in that area that, obviously is now a reservoir. And this is one more picture of the Applegate Dam area before the development of the reservoir. So the conclusions that I've come to from looking at all these photographs are that the Osborne photos appear to show a historically diverse mixed severity fire mosaic composed of closed canopy forest, open forest, brush fields, hardwood stands, regenerating conifers, edaphically controlled grasslands, and fire-mediated openings. So edaphically controlled grasslands are they're moderated by soil conditions and rather than fire. There's also a lot of repeated high severity fire on the landscape, and it was more prominent than it is today. So that created a lot of those brushy areas on the south facing slopes. And you can see the effect of those higher severity fires on the upper third of the slope in particular. I would note that these conditions are consistent with the contemporary fire effects that we're seeing in the Applegate River watershed today. And so we are currently within the range of variability for fire in the Klamath Mountains, meaning that the fires are burning in a similar pattern to those that we saw in historic era. Although the patterns are similar, a lot more acres burned historically in the Applegate River watershed than are currently burning today. And what that did was create an abundance of fire footprints along the landscape, which included relatively recent high severity fire patches that appear to have moderated fire size and severity on the landscape and stand level. And we're seeing a similar pattern develop today in the frequent fire forests in the Red Buttes Wilderness, where fires have burned in 1987, 2013, 2017, and 2020. We are also seeing that, and I think it's important to note that vegetation mosaics and conditions have sustained significant continuity over time, while also shifting around the landscape in response to climate and disturbance processes. So under the current trajectory, contemporary wildland fires effects will likely reestablish at least some of these fire-mediated openings and shift those landscape mosaics around the landscape like we saw in the Osborne photos. I also think it's important to note that although underappreciated, historic climatic conditions, including colder temperatures, heavy snow loads, and shorter growing seasons supported more alpine conditions at the higher elevations. And these climatic conditions influence vegetation by favoring herbaceous growth over trees and shrubs. So as those snow loads have been reduced over time, we're seeing more woody species and more subalpine forest move up towards the ridge tops. And that's also, obviously influenced by fire, but I think largely on the Siskiyou Crest, influenced by those heavy snow loads. A lot of people don't appreciate that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we were coming out of the little ice ages and had significantly deeper snowpacks and longer winter seasons in the high country. I also think it's important to acknowledge that there was a lot of grazing that went on and still goes on this landscape, and it's heavily impacted a lot of herbaceous plant communities. It's reduced the bunch grass clearings, creating those cattle and sheep barrens. It's reduced water tables and wet meadows, and all of those conditions lead to an expansion of woody vegetation, to biodiversity loss, and to a reduction in particular in the bunch grass clearings that used to exist in the high elevation forests more prominently. And then finally, I think it's also important to note that the impact of both historic and contemporary logging is persistent on this landscape, and especially at low to mid elevations, it will continue to affect forest composition and structure, as well as disturbance processes such as fires and fire effects into the future. So what we're seeing is, historic changes over time. What we're seeing in these photographs is 90 years of vegetation change, but we're also seeing some continuity, and we're also seeing the ability of contemporary fires to recreate at least some of these conditions on the landscape and maintain the unique biology of the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains and the Applegate River Watershed. So that's pretty much my presentation tonight, and I hope people enjoyed all the photographs and gained a better understanding of habitat conditions historically and also today in the Applegate River Watershed. So I'm going to stop my screen share here and invite you all to unmute. And if anyone has questions, I'm willing to take those right now. Otherwise, if there's no questions, we can wrap this thing up. So I am not hearing any questions. I will check the chat real quick. And it looks like we do not have any questions. So unless I hear anything immediately, I'm going to just shut this thing down. And I would really encourage folks to participate in the next
Say hello.
Zoom.
Luke, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hey, Luke, this is Evan and Tara.
Okay.
And I just wanted to say excellent job. And I'm curious, have you in your research been able to find any earlier historical records about this forested area that we live in?
Well, there's a lot of different ways you can research historic vegetation patterns. One of those is photographs. There are earlier photographs that I have access to than the Osborne photos, but what's nice about the Osborne photos is that there are so many of them. They basically took 3 photographs from every fire lookout in the entire West. So you can look at Osborne photos also, you can find Osborne photos for Montana and Idaho and California and Washington and all over the place. So it gives you a good idea what the historic conditions looked like before fire suppression and before a lot of the logging took place. You can also look at historic landscape descriptions. And there's definitely been a lot of information that you can glean from early Forest Service documents. And there's various ways you can look at that. Some people do stand reconstructions and things like that as well, which I think are a little less accurate, but also have a lot to tell. So it's kind of a mixture of things you can look and also just being able to read the landscape when you're out in the forest and you start to understand the patterns, the historic patterns, you can start to see those areas where maybe there were more open forest at one point and it's closed in, or maybe where there was more closed forest and it's been logged off, or where vegetation's shifted over time. So it's kind of a mixture, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it. But I really do like the historic photographs because I do think that they're unbiased, unlike landscape descriptions. And I think that they often really provide more of an accurate depiction of the conditions, during the time that those photographs were taken. So it just depends on where you're at in terms of what kind of access you're going to have, because a lot of stuff really wasn't recorded very well during the historic period in a lot of the remote areas. And again, I think that's one of the things that's really cool about the Osborne photos, is that most of the historic photographs you get are from more the settled areas. And these photographs allow you to look at the more remote, isolated areas that were less impacted by the settlement patterns and more influenced by natural vegetation patterns and fire mosaic.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Excellent job. And I've got some pictures from my grandfather in the area here from the mid 1930s and early 1920s. So I will try to get them to you. But thanks. Great job. It was excellent
thank you. We
presentation.
appreciate you.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Good night.
If there's any other questions, I'll take them now. And if not, then we'll wrap this up. All right. Well, I'll take that as no more questions. And I'm going to stop recording here. And